Welcome back to Secrets Exposed. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. You're the reason these stories worth sharing. Tell us where you're watching from, city or country. We're amazed by how far these tales reach. Subscribe our channel and press bell icon to get daily new and amazing stories for you. All right, let's begin. The neighborhood was still when the car dropped Grant Harper at the curb. A fine mist hung in the air, softening the glow of the streetlights. He stood motionless for a moment, duffel slung over his shoulder, staring at the house that used to feel like home. The maple tree outside swayed with the same restless groan it always had, but inside there were no lights, no balloons, no welcome waiting. Just silence. He slid the key into the lock, surprised it still fit, and stepped into the narrow hallway. The air smelled faintly of bleach and grease, the kind that clung after too many takeout nights. The living room was as he remembered. Same sagging couch, same scuffed coffee table, but colder, as if the warmth had been drained. His boots creaked against the floorboards, each sound echoing too loudly in the quiet. Grant walked toward the small bedroom at the end of the hall. Mason's room. His heart beat faster with each step, expecting a sleepy dad or a half-awake smile. He turned the knob carefully and eased the door open. The blinds were drawn, but a slice of streetlight spilled across the wall, illuminating the faded Captain Orion poster. The bed was made, but too neatly, tucked in a way his 9-year-old never managed. A faint rustle came from below. Grant froze, listening. Then he bent down and lifted the bed skirt. Two eyes stared back at him, wide and shimmering. His son, Mason, lay flat against the floorboards, his whole body trembling. His small hands clutched the edge of the mattress, as if the wood itself could shield him. "Buddy," Grant whispered, lowering himself onto his knees. "It's me. It's Dad." For a moment, Mason didn't move. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, like a cornered animal. Then, with a sudden sob, he crawled out and flung his arms around Grant's chest. His tiny body shook violently, pressing into the rough fabric of his father's jacket. Grant wrapped his arms around him, heart pounding. Hey, you're safe. I've got you." He could feel the heat of Mason's forehead, the dampness of tears soaking through his shirt. "Don't let him hear," Mason whispered, voice so faint it was almost swallowed by the silence of the room. Grant pulled back, searching his son's face. "Who? What do you mean?" "Mom's man." The words cracked like glass. Mason's eyes darted to the doorway, as if expecting a shadow to appear. "He makes me sleep outside, with the dogs." Grant's stomach turned to stone. He tried to keep his face calm, his voice level. "Show me, Mason. Please." He guided his son gently into the small bathroom across the hall and shut the door. The weak overhead light buzzed to life, casting everything in pale yellow. Mason stood stiffly, eyes lowered. Grant knelt, lifting the hem of his son's shirt. The breath caught in his throat. Dark bruises marbled Mason's ribs, some fresh, others yellowing with age. Across his back stretched a long welt, ridged and raw, ending in a deep, oval burn-like scar. The shape was precise, a shield with 3 small chevrons. Not random, not an accident. Grant steadied his shaking hands and reached for his phone. The shutter clicked softly as he took photo after photo. Mason flinched at the sound, eyes filling with shame. "It's just for the doctor," Grant said gently, setting the phone aside. "So we can help you." Mason's lip trembled. He said, "If I tell, he'll take Mom away." "And me too." Grant's jaw tightened, but he forced his tone into calm certainty. "Listen to me. Nobody's taking you away from me. Nobody." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling how thin he was beneath the fabric. "We're going to fix this. Right now." He hugged Mason again, longer this time, and felt his son finally release a breath against his chest. Outside, the house creaked as if shifting under some unseen weight. But inside that bathroom, Grant made a silent vow. No one would break his child and walk away free. The bathroom light buzzed overhead as Grant held Mason close. The boy's small body, he finally stopped trembling, though his breaths were still shallow, uneven. Grant pressed a hand against his son's back, careful to avoid the welt. I won't let this happen again, he thought. Then from the hallway came a sound, slow footsteps, deliberate. A creak of the floorboard near the kitchen. Grant's chest tightened. He flicked off the bathroom light, held Mason's hand, and whispered, "Stay behind me." They moved down the narrow hall. The kitchen light snapped on suddenly, bathing the room in harsh brightness. Vanessa stood there in a faded robe, hair piled messily on her head, one hand clutching a mug of coffee. She didn't look surprised to see them. Instead, her eyes narrowed, lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Look who decided to show up. The great soldier himself." Behind her, leaning casually against the doorframe, was Rick. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud. Stocky, muscular arms folded across his chest, beard neatly trimmed, eyes dark and unflinching. The black t-shirt he wore stretched across his shoulders, and stitched into the fabric just above his heart was a small logo, a shield with 3 tiny chevrons. Grant's stomach turned. The mark matched the scar on Mason's back. He stepped forward, keeping his son behind him. His voice was steady, controlled. "Mason is hurt. I'm taking him to urgent care. Now." Vanessa let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, please. He's always exaggerating. You've been gone for months, Grant. You don't just walk in here and start playing hero again." Rick's lips twitched into a smirk. "House rules," he said, his tone calm, but edged with something dangerous. "Kid needs to learn discipline. That's all this is." Grant's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay composed. Violence here would solve nothing. "Discipline doesn't leave scars," he said quietly. Rick pushed himself off the doorway, taking one step closer. "Maybe where you're from, but in this house." Grant cut him off, his voice firm and low. "This is my son, and I'm taking him to a doctor. If you think I shouldn't, call the police. I'll wait outside." Vanessa scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You've always been dramatic. No wonder Mason acts weak. He's just like you." Grant didn't flinch. He knew anger was what they wanted from him, but he wouldn't give it. Instead, he placed a steady hand on Mason's shoulder and gently guided him toward the door. Rick's frame loomed, blocking the path for half a second, but Grant met his gaze, calm, unyielding, the kind of stare a soldier learns when silence is sharper than a blade. Rick shifted, but only slightly, as if testing boundaries. Finally, with a faint scoff, he stepped aside. Vanessa crossed her arms, her nails digging into the fabric of her robe, and muttered, "Pathetic. You think this changes anything? He'll be back here tomorrow." Grant didn't answer. He opened the front door and led Mason into the cool night. The air outside felt cleaner, freer, though the tension still knotted tight in his chest. He pulled Mason close, keeping a protective arm around him as they walked to the car parked down the street. Mason glanced back once at the house, his face pale in the streetlight. "Dad," he whispered, "what if he follows us?" Grant tightened his grip on his son's hand. "Then he'll regret it," he said softly, though inside his thoughts were racing. He couldn't afford a mistake. Not now. As the car pulled away, the house shrank in the rearview mirror, but Grant's mind stayed locked on the scar on Mason's back, the shoebox of secrets that boy might still be hiding, and the smirk on Rick's face. This wasn't just a fight about bruises. It was about power, control, and something Vanessa was hiding beneath her bitterness. And Grant knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tonight had only been the opening move. The car hummed quietly as Grant drove through the sleeping streets. Mason sat pressed against the passenger seat, hoodie pulled tight around his small frame, his eyes fixed on the dark blur outside the window. Every few minutes, the boy flinched at shadows that weren't there. Grant kept one hand steady on the wheel and the other resting lightly on his son's shoulder, as if grounding him. The urgent care center glowed sterile white against the night. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. A nurse at the desk looked up, her professional smile faltering when she saw Mason clinging to Grant's sleeve. Within minutes, they were ushered into a small examination room where the walls were too bare and the light too sharp. Mason perched on the edge of the bed, knees pulled up, arms wrapped tight around them. Grant sat close, trying to project calm, though inside his chest burned with anger. The doctor arrived, a woman in her 40s with calm eyes and a gentle voice. She knelt to Mason's level, speaking softly. "Hey there, buddy. Can I take a quick look to make sure you're okay?" Mason's gaze darted to Grant. Grant nodded. "It's all right, son. I'm right here." Slowly, Mason lifted his shirt. The doctor's eyes tightened, but her voice stayed steady. She examined the bruises, the scar, the faint marks that told a story of repeated harm. When she touched the welt across his back, Mason flinched hard. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Mason gave a tiny nod. Grant leaned forward. He said it was from a belt. He explained quietly. "I took photos." The doctor straightened, her expression professional but heavy. "These injuries are consistent with pattern trauma. Some are older, some more recent. I'm required to file a report with Child Protective Services immediately." Grant's stomach tightened. "Do it," he said firmly. As the doctor stepped out to make the call, Mason lowered his eyes. His small voice cracked the silence. "Dad, he makes me sleep outside." Grant blinked, throat tight. "Outside." Mason nodded, clutching the hem of his hoodie. "With the dogs. He says if I cry, they'll cry louder and it'll be my fault." His voice trembled, each word an admission carved out of fear. "Sometimes he sprays me with a hose to make me stop asking about you." Grant's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice gentle. "You should never have had to go through that." "I tried to be quiet," Mason whispered, eyes brimming. "I tried to be good so he wouldn't tell Mom I was weak." Grant felt a surge of rage, but he swallowed it down. What Mason needed wasn't fire, but steady ground. "You're not weak," he said firmly. "You're brave. Braver than anyone I know." The boy's shoulders eased, just slightly, as if the words carved out a space where he could breathe. When the doctor returned, she handed Grant a form. "CPS will follow up first thing in the morning. In the meantime, I suggest you keep him somewhere safe tonight. Not at that house." Grant nodded. He already knew where they'd go. Later, in the dim waiting room, Mason's head rested on his father's shoulder, eyes half closed. Grant scrolled through his phone, pulling up Shield 3 Security's website. On the screen glowed promotional photos. Uniformed men, tactical belts gleaming. One image stopped him cold. The belt buckle stamped with a shield and 3 chevrons. The exact pattern seared into Mason's back. Grant took a screenshot and saved it alongside the medical notes and photos. Evidence. Piece by piece, the puzzle was forming, and with every click of his phone, his resolve hardened. He looked down at his son, finally asleep against his chest. Mason's lips were parted, his face slack with exhaustion. The weight of his small body was both fragile and grounding. Grant pressed his hand lightly to his son's back, careful not to touch the welt. He whispered to himself, not for Mason to hear, but to anchor the promise inside. "No one ever lays a hand on you again. Not while I breathe." Outside, dawn was still hours away, but the first cracks of light felt closer than they had in years. Morning thinned the night into a pale smear when the knock came. 3 measured taps that made the hallway feel narrower. Grant had dozed upright in the chair beside the motel bed, one hand on the blanket covering Mason. He opened the door to a woman in a slate gray cardigan, clipboard in one arm, badge on a lanyard. "Child Protective Services," she said, voice calm. "I'm Rivera. May I come in?" Grant stepped aside. Mason blinked awake, sat up slowly, and glanced from Rivera to his father. Grant nodded. "It's all right. She's here to help." Rivera's eyes were steady but kind, the way of someone used to both truth and denial. She introduced herself to Mason at his level, notepad still tucked away. "Can I ask you a few questions? You can say stop at any time." Mason's hands twisted in the blanket. "Okay." They began with soft things, school, favorite subjects, the cartoon he watched last night. Then, carefully, Rivera eased toward what mattered. "Has anyone in your home hurt you, Mason?" He looked down. His voice was barely a thread. "Mom's man. Rick." Grant watched Rivera mark nothing. "Just listen. How does he hurt you?" "He makes me sleep outside," Mason said, eyes flicking to the motel window as if it could turn into their porch. "With the dogs. He says I'm noisy if I cry. Sometimes the hose." Rivera's throat moved once. "Does your mom know?" Mason hesitated, the kind of pause that says, not in the way she can admit. He nodded, then shook his head. She says I make trouble. Rivera asked to see the injuries. Grant stepped back as Mason lifted his shirt. The welt, the bruises, morning light made them starker. Rivera didn't gasp, didn't frown. She noted the pattern with a medic's neutrality. Thank you, Mason. That was brave. By mid-morning, they drove to the house for a scheduled home visit. The old maple shivered in a weak breeze. Vanessa opened the door with a practiced rush of tears, robe tied more carefully today, mascara already damp. I have no idea what stories he's told, she said, pulling Rivera inside. He bruises easily. He's sensitive. Grant is dramatic. Rick hovered by the kitchen island, arms crossed, a half-finished protein shake sweating on the counter. His black t-shirt from last night had been swapped for another. Same stitch shield and 3 chevrons over the chest. His gaze found Grant's and stayed there, unblinking. Rivera measured rooms with quiet eyes. The living room, clean enough. The backyard visible through the sliding door. Metal kennels along the fence, bowls, a coiled hose bright as a warning. Do the dogs sleep outside every night? She asked. Sure, Rick said. They're dogs. Anyone else? Rivera's tone did not change. Rick smiled without teeth. Lady, that's ridiculous. Vanessa shot him a look too sharp to be love and then smoothed it into worry. He's been acting out. He misses his father. I've tried everything. Rick's been firm because someone has to be. Firm how? Chores. Consequences, Rick said, thumb sliding instinctively toward his belt. Grant saw the gesture and felt the same cold clarity he'd felt beneath fluorescent lights, the welt ending in a stamped oval. Rivera asked to speak to Mason alone in his room. Vanessa objected on principle, then thought better of the optics and stood aside. Grant waited in the hallway with the faint smell of bleach and something sour beneath it. From behind the door came Rivera's steady murmur and Mason's small, halting answers. When they emerged, Rivera closed her notebook. Here's what will happen, she said evenly, addressing the adults. We're instituting a 72-hour safety plan. Mason will remain with his father while we complete our investigation. Vanessa's face cracked, the tears drying in assault. You're punishing me for asking for help. I'm protecting a child, Rivera said. Rick's jaw worked. You can't just take him. Rivera turned to him fully for the first time. There will also be a temporary order barring you from contact pending the outcome. Any violation will be documented and forwarded to law enforcement. Do you understand? A pulse jumped in Rick's temple. Crystal. Vanessa's tears hardened into something brittle. So he gets to swoop in after months away and play hero? He can't even keep a job. He left us. Grant's voice stayed level. We'll follow the plan. Mason needs quiet. I'll send a list of what he needs for school. Rivera nodded. Mr. Harper, keep all medical discharge papers, photos, and any written notes Mason may have kept. We'll need copies. Her gaze slid briefly to the backyard, to the hose, to the kennels. Also, if there are any cameras on the property, doorbell or otherwise, we'll need to review footage. Vanessa flinched so subtly it could have been a shiver. Grant filed it away. They packed fast. Clothes, school books, the stuffed otter with the worn tail. Mason paused at his desk drawer, glanced toward Vanessa, then slipped a small stack of index cards into his backpack. Vanessa saw the motion and looked away, lashes trembling. At the threshold, she couldn't help one last strike. You're making this worse, she hissed at Grant, too low for Rivera to hear. If they dig, they'll find things you don't want found. Grant met her eyes. The only thing I want found is the truth. Back at the motel, the quiet felt different. No longer a pause between storms, but a contained space where they could gather breath. Grant set microwave mac and cheese on the tiny table and let Mason pick a movie again. When the boy laughed too loudly at a pratfall, he didn't shush him. After Mason fell asleep, Grant opened his laptop. He began a clean timeline, dates, photos, urgent care notes, Rivera's card, the logo he'd screenshotted from the Shield 3 catalog, the backyard, the hose, the kennels, Rick's reflexive hand to his belt. He added one line at the bottom and stared at it until the letters steadied. Next, secure footage. On the nightstand, Mason's backpack sagged open. A corner of an index card peeked out, the thick pencil marks of a child trying to fix the world by writing it down. Grant slid the card fully inside and zipped the pocket closed, not because he didn't want to see, but because he wanted the boy to decide when to show him. At midnight, the motel AC kicked on with a clatter, then settled into a steady breath. Grant watched his son sleeping, the blanket rising and falling, and let the plan assemble itself bone by bone. 72 hours. Enough time to do this right. Enough time to make sure outside with the dogs became a sentence no one would ever use again. The next evening fell heavy and wet, the kind of sky that pressed low as if it knew secrets. Grant parked 2 blocks from the house, engine cut, Mason asleep in the back seat with his stuffed otter hugged tight. The CPS safety plan gave him 72 hours, but school books and clothes were still inside, and Mason had whispered he left something else, something important. Grant stepped out quietly, locking the car with only the mechanical click of the key. He walked the familiar sidewalk, every step measured. The house loomed darker than it should have. From the street, the backyard was sealed by the gate he had once hung himself. He ran his thumb over the screws. Loose. A soldier's instincts worked fast. Weakness meant opportunity. He pulled a coin from his pocket, twisted the screws out, and eased the gate open. The yard smelled of damp earth. Along the fence, metal kennels crouched like cages. 2 mixed-breed dogs pressed their noses through the bars, tails wagging uncertainly, as though sensing both danger and rescue. Their bowls lay overturned, water stained into the ground. A green hose lay coiled like a snake near the shed. Grant's eyes shifted to the hook on the shed wall. A belt dangled there, heavy leather, the brass buckle glinting faintly even in the low light. He stepped closer, pulled his phone out, and snapped photos, close-ups, angles with his quarter pressed against the buckle for scale. The emblem stamped into it was clear, a shield with 3 chevrons. The same mark carved into Mason's back. Evidence. He scanned the yard again and noticed the small porch light above the back door. A camera was tucked beneath it, barely visible. Cheap model, motion sensor blinking faintly. Grant reached up, unscrewed the mount with careful fingers, and slipped the micro SD card into a Ziploc bag from his jacket pocket. Another piece for the file. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. He crept down the hall to Mason's room, the air tinged with stale detergent. He gathered math and reading books, a hoodie Mason liked, then bent to retrieve the stuffed otter from under the pillow. That's when he noticed a shoebox under the bed, its lid slightly ajar. Grant slid it out slowly. Inside were index cards, scrawled in thick pencil with a child's hand. Slept outside 3 hours. Cold. Hose today. Bell for talking. Don't tell Dad, or he'll take me away from Mom. Grant's throat tightened. He ran his hand across the cards, each word heavy with the weight of nights Mason couldn't say aloud. His stomach churned with both rage and sorrow. Rage at the man who did this, sorrow for the boy who thought he had to keep records to prove his own pain. He placed the lid back carefully, exactly as he'd found it. A floorboard creaked. Grant turned. Vanessa stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, her face pale as moonlight. Her voice was low, trembling with something that wasn't quite fear. "What are you doing here?" Grant held the hoodie in one hand, the backpack in the other. "Collecting what Mason needs for school." His voice was even clipped. Her eyes flicked to the shoebox under the bed, then back to him. "If you make this a thing, they'll dig." Her words came out harsh, but her expression cracked at the edges. "And you won't like what they find." Grant studied her for a long moment. The weight of her words hung between them. "They'll dig, and you won't like what they find." Not denial, not outrage. Something closer to warning. Or confession. He straightened, tucking Mason's things into the backpack. "The only thing I want found," he said quietly, "is the truth." Vanessa flinched as if the word itself had struck her. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, her mocking confidence faltered. She stepped back, letting him pass, her hands trembling against the doorframe. Grant moved through the hallway, every sense alert, waiting for Rick's bulk to appear from the shadows. But the house stayed silent, heavy with secrets. At the front door, he paused, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator. The home he once thought safe now felt like a trap built brick by brick around lies. He stepped outside, closing the door softly behind him. The night air was cooler, sharp in his lungs. He walked back to the car, slid into the driver's seat, and glanced at Mason asleep in the back. The boy stirred slightly, clutching the otter closer. Grant started the engine, his jaw set. He had the belt photos, the camera card, the shoebox, enough to push deeper. And Vanessa's words, cryptic, heavy, echoed louder than the car's hum. Driving into the night, Grant understood one thing. The bruises weren't the whole story. Something darker threaded beneath. And now the digging had begun. Rain streaked across the courthouse windows like ink bleeding down glass. The corridor smelled of old paper and coffee gone cold. Grant sat rigid in the wooden bench outside the courtroom, his suit pressed but plain, a quiet strength in his posture. Beside him, Mason fidgeted with the ear of his stuffed otter, the faded fur worn smooth from years of clutching. When the bailiff opened the doors, they stepped inside. The room was solemn. High ceilings, flags in each corner, the judge's bench elevated to a perch of authority. Vanessa sat on the opposite side, her hair neatly done, a navy dress chosen to suggest composure. But the mascara ringed faintly under her eyes, betraying restless nights. Rick sat close to her, his jaw set, arms folded, his black jacket zipped to cover any logo. His eyes swept the room and landed on Grant, unblinking, almost daring him to flinch. The judge entered. A gavel struck once. This hearing is now in session. Grant's lawyer, a compact man with sharp glasses, stood first. Your Honor, the child Mason Harper has been subjected to ongoing abuse in the home of his mother and her partner, Rick Dalton. We present medical records from urgent care documenting patterned injuries consistent with belt strikes. We also submit photographic evidence, a security card retrieved from the porch camera, and written notes Mason himself recorded. He gestured to the screen where the photos appeared one by one. Purple blooms across a ribcage, the long welt ending in an oval shield imprint. Gasps rippled softly through the gallery. Mason curled into his seat, hiding his face in the otter's fur. Grant squeezed his son's shoulder gently, grounding him. Rick shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing at the screen. The judge leaned forward. What is this mark at the end of the welt? The lawyer clicked to the next slide, a catalog image from Shield 3 Security, showing the exact belt buckle. Your Honor, this emblem, a shield with 3 chevrons, matches precisely the pattern left on the child's back. Mr. Dalton is employed by Shield 3 Security and wears this gear regularly. The judge's gaze flicked to Rick. He said nothing, only ground his teeth. Vanessa's attorney rose quickly. Your Honor, these are circumstantial connections. The boy could have sustained these injuries in other ways. Children bruise. The judge's voice cut sharp. Do not insult this court with speculation. The bruise pattern is clear. The lawyer pressed forward. We also have security footage from the porch camera, which shows Mason outside in the early hours of the morning, alone, shivering, curled on a patio chair. At 6:05 a.m., another clip shows Mr. Dalton with a hose spraying toward the child. The room went utterly still. The video played on screen, grainy but undeniable. Mason whimpered softly, shrinking into Grant's side. Vanessa's hand shot to her mouth, eyes wide, tears threatening her carefully made face. Rick sat forward, fists clenched, his body tense like a coil. The judge's jaw hardened. And the notes. Grant's lawyer lifted the shoebox gently and placed several index cards on the evidence table. Written in shaky block letters. Slept outside 3 hours. Hosed today. Bell for talking. The courtroom seemed to breathe as one, heavy and disgusted. Rick leaned toward Vanessa, whispering something harsh. She flinched, her shoulders curling inward, and for the first time her mask cracked. Not scorn, not anger, but something closer to dread. The judge struck the gavel once. Effective immediately, Mr. Harper will have temporary sole custody of Mason Harper. Mr. Dalton is ordered to have no contact with the child. A restraining order is in effect until the investigation is concluded. Vanessa's attorney sputtered. Your Honor. Enough, the judge snapped. This evidence speaks louder than any defense you might attempt. As the gavel fell again, the weight in the room shifted. Grant exhaled, his grip tightening around Mason's hand. He looked across the courtroom. Vanessa's eyes flicked to him, red-rimmed, and then away, as if she couldn't bear the truth staring back. Rick, though restrained by silence, seethed with a fury that promised this wasn't over. In the hallway afterward, Vanessa caught up to Grant. She grabbed his sleeve, her voice trembling, low enough that only he could hear. If this goes to blood, it ruins everything. Grant froze. The words were sharp, cryptic, and heavy. Blood. He studied her, searching her face for answers, but she looked away, biting her lip as though she had already said too much. Grant placed a steady hand on Mason's shoulder and guided him away. His son needed safety, not riddles. But Vanessa's warning clung to him like smoke. The battle for custody was just beginning, and beneath it, a darker truth pulsed, waiting to surface. The CPS office was quiet except for the tick of the wall clock and a shuffle of papers being moved from one file to another. The space smelled faintly of coffee gone stale, the kind that had been poured too early and left too long. Grant sat across the small conference table, his posture straight, but his eyes sharp, waiting. Mason sat beside him, his stuffed otter clutched under the table, his foot tapping softly against the carpet in nervous rhythm. Rivera, the CPS investigator, set a thin folder in front of her and looked up. Mr. Harper, she began, the evidence presented in court gives us reason to believe this situation has been ongoing for some time. But there are gaps. We need more context. And she paused, choosing her words carefully. Mrs. Harper has agreed to provide a statement. Grant's stomach tightened. Vanessa. Rivera nodded. She stood, opened the door, and gestured. Vanessa entered hesitantly. Gone was the polished navy dress from court. Today she wore a simple sweater, her hair loose, face pale, mascara smudged faintly under her eyes. She looked smaller, as though the weight of the last few days had carved inches off her frame. She sat opposite Grant, unable to meet his gaze. Her hands twisted together on the table. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Rivera leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Harper, whenever you're ready. Vanessa drew in a breath, her eyes glassy. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said softly. I thought I could control it. I thought if I managed things, it would never come to this. Grant's jaw tightened. Managed what? She glanced at him, her lips trembling, then looked away. Rick, she swallowed hard. And Mason. The air in the room thinned. Rivera's pen hovered above the page. I met Rick years ago, Vanessa continued, voice breaking. During one of your deployments. I was lonely. He was there, always offering to help. Fix the car, patch the roof, carry the groceries. One night became two, and then it didn't stop. When I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't sure who the father was. Grant sat still, his face unreadable, but inside, her words struck like cold steel. Blood. The word she had whispered in the hallway now echoed with new meaning. I told myself it didn't matter, Vanessa said quickly, tears spilling down her cheeks. You were overseas. You were Mason's father in every way that counted. But Rick, he found out. He got hold of a message I sent a friend years ago, and after that, he wouldn't let it go. He said Mason was his. He said he'd raise him, but his way. I thought. She shook her head, voice fracturing. I thought if I let him stay close, he'd back off. That he'd be satisfied. Rivera scribbled quietly, her expression neutral, but her eyes grave. Vanessa pressed her palms flat on the table. But it wasn't enough. He wanted control. Discipline, he called it. I saw the bruises. I told myself they weren't as bad as they looked. That Mason would be fine. That Grant. Her eyes flicked up to him for a split second, guilt blazing through. That you would never have to know. Grant's voice was low, steady, but it cut like a blade. You let him hurt our son. Tears slipped down Vanessa's face, but she didn't argue. I was scared. Scared that if the truth came out, I'd lose everything. That Mason would hate me. That you'd hate me. So I mocked you. I pushed you away. It was easier to blame you than face what I'd done. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Mason shifted in his seat, his small voice breaking through like a fragile bell. "Mom, why didn't you stop him?" Vanessa's face crumpled. She reached toward him, but Mason pulled the otter tighter and leaned into Grant instead. The rejection stung across her face like a slap. Rivera cleared her throat gently. "Mrs. Harper, thank you for your statement. We'll include this in our report." She closed the file, the click loud in the silence. "But understand, what you've admitted will have consequences. You enabled abuse by silence. The court will decide how this affects custody and your parental rights." Vanessa nodded numbly, tears sliding unchecked. "I know," she whispered. Grant placed a protective arm around Mason. His voice remained calm, but steel laced every word. "Whatever Blood says, he's my son, and I'll protect him, with or without you." For the first time, Vanessa didn't argue. She just folded it on herself, small and broken, as if her secrets had finally crushed her from the inside. Grant rose, guiding Mason toward the door. The boy looked back once at his mother, his eyes wide and wet, but he didn't speak. The hallway beyond seemed brighter than the room they left behind, but also colder. The truth had surfaced, sharp and brutal. Mason's world had changed forever, and Grant's battle had only deepened. Night at the motel carried its own rhythm. The hum of the AC, the muffled traffic on the highway, the occasional slam of a car door in the lot. Grant had almost begun to believe they were cocooned in safety until the messages started. The first arrived just after midnight. A photo of Mason's schoolyard, grainy but clear, the playground empty under a pale moon. No text, just the image. Grant stared at it, every instinct sharpening. The second message came minutes later. "Hope you're sleeping inside, champ." Grant saved the images, forwarded them to his lawyer and Rivera at CPS, and locked the phone away where Mason wouldn't see. But the boy sensed the tension anyway. In the morning, Mason asked, "Dad, did he find us?" Grant crouched eye to eye with him. "He wants us scared, but we're not going to give him that." Still, his stomach tightened. Rick's reach stretched further than he'd expected. Shield 3 Security sent out a statement the next day. Short, cold, effective immediately. Rick Dalton's employment with Shield 3 is terminated. No apology, no admission. Just a company severing a poison limb. But Grant knew men like Rick didn't fold when cut loose. They grew more dangerous. Mason grew quieter. At dinner, he pushed food around his plate, barely speaking. At night, he woke from dreams with sharp breaths, whispering, "Don't make me go outside." One evening, as Grant tucked him in, Mason asked, "If he's my blood, does that mean I'll be like him?" The question still Grant's hands. He sat on the edge of the bed, choosing words carefully. "Blood is plumbing, Mason. That's all. Character is choice. And you've already shown more courage than most grown men." Mason searched his father's face. "But he says I look like him." Grant swallowed hard. The resemblance had crossed his mind, the set of the jaw, the angle of the brow. But resemblance wasn't destiny. He cupped Mason's shoulder gently. "Looking like someone doesn't make you them. What makes you you is the choices you make every day. And you chose to tell the truth. That makes you nothing like him." For the first time that day, Mason's shoulders eased. He hugged the otter tight and whispered, "I want to be like you, Dad." The next morning, Rivera called. "We need to meet. New information." At the office, Rivera laid out the threats Rick had made. Texts, surveillance images traced back to prepaid phones purchased near his neighborhood. "He's escalating. We've flagged law enforcement. But this raises urgency for the paternity test." Grant nodded grimly. Mason sat in the corner chair, swinging his legs, unaware of the storm's full size. The test meant answers, one way or another. And the answer could cut. That evening on the drive back, the boy stared out the window, quiet. Then, almost to himself, he said, "If he's my blood, does that mean Mom always loved him more?" The words pierced deeper than any blade. Grant gripped the wheel, searching for a truth that wouldn't shatter him. "No, son. Your mom made mistakes, but love isn't measured in blood. Don't let his lies tell you what her heart felt." Mason turned, eyes wide and wet. Then why didn't she stop him? Grant had no answer that wouldn't scar. He reached across, squeezed his son's hand, and said only, because she was weak, "But you're strong. and I'll be strong for you. Back at the motel, Grant lay awake long after Mason slept, staring at the ceiling. The belt, the shoebox, the porch camera, they painted one picture. Vanessa's confession painted another. And now, Rick's shadow loomed closer despite the restraining order. Grant opened his laptop, added the new threats to the timeline, and stared at the words at the bottom of his file. Next, secure the truth. The test results would come soon, and with them, the line between blood and choice would either fracture or bind forever. Thursday afternoon, the courthouse felt colder than usual, its walls echoing with the shuffle of shoes and the scrape of chairs. Rain had just stopped outside, leaving streaks across the tall windows that fractured the gray light into dull ribbons. Grant sat at the petitioner's table, a folder of evidence neatly stacked in front of him. Mason was not there. Rivera had arranged for him to wait in a supervised playroom down the hall, spared from whatever verdict the day might hold. Vanessa entered first. Her hair was pinned tight, face pale, every line drawn as though she had aged years since her last testimony. She sat with her attorney, eyes flicking nervously to Grant, then away. Moments later, Rick appeared. He wore a pressed shirt and dark tie, but no polish could soften the edge in his stare. The bailiff directed him to his seat, where he leaned back, arms crossed, jaw twitching with a pulse that betrayed the effort of restraint. The judge, deliberate and steady, opened the session. Today we address pending custody and protective matters. DNA results have been received and will be entered into the record. She looked to the clerk, who handed over a sealed envelope. The rip of paper echoed louder than it should have. The judge scanned the document, expression unreadable. Then she lifted her eyes. Per the certified results, there's a 99.9% probability that Rick Dalton is the biological father of Mason Harper. The room went silent, a silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air itself. Grant's chest tightened, his jaw set. He had known this possibility, had braced for it, but hearing it spoken aloud carved into him all the same. Rick smirked, leaning forward. So now it's official, he said, voice low but carrying. He's mine. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp. Quiet, Mr. Dalton. Biology does not erase abuse. These proceedings concern the child's safety, not your pride. Grant exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the truth of those words. He turned his eyes toward Vanessa. Her face was crumpled, eyes wet, lips trembling with words she couldn't force out. Shame rolled off her in waves. Grant's lawyer rose, voice clear and steady. Your Honor, biological paternity does not negate the documented abuse. We have photographic evidence, medical records, security footage, and the child's own written accounts. DNA may change labels, but it cannot wash away actions. He held up a stack of photos. This man's belt carved his emblem into a child's back. That is not fatherhood. That is cruelty. The judge nodded, her face stern. She looked directly at Rick. You sought to claim this boy as yours. Instead, you ensured he will never be in your custody. Paternity comes with responsibility, and yours is to face the charges before you. Child endangerment, assault, violation of a protection order. Rick's smirk faltered. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. You can't cut me out, he growled. He'll know one day. He'll know I'm the real one. Grant stood then, his voice calm but edged with steel. He already knows who his father is, and it isn't you. For a heartbeat, the two men locked eyes across the courtroom, one seething with entitlement, the other anchored in unshakable resolve. The judge's ruling came down like iron. Temporary sole custody remains with Grant Harper. Mr. Dalton will have no contact with Mason. Vanessa Harper will undergo a full parental evaluation before any visitation is considered. Case review scheduled in 30 days. The gavel struck again. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people rose. Vanessa sank in her chair, hands covering her face. Rick shoved back from the table, glaring at Grant with a hatred that promised retaliation. Bailiffs stepped in closer, ready to intervene if necessary. Grant gathered his folder, steady as ever, and walked out without another glance. In the hallway, Rivera was waiting with Mason, who looked up with wide eyes. Dad? What happened? Grant crouched, forcing a small, steady smile. The truth came out, he said, and it means you're safe. Mason searched his face, as though measuring the words against the tremor in his father's voice. Slowly, he nodded and gripped Grant's hand. Together, they walked down the long hallway, the weight of blood and choice pressing heavy, but the bond between them holding firm. The night after court was restless. The motel's thin curtains fluttered with every gust of wind, and Mason tossed in his sleep, murmuring through dreams he couldn't shake. Grant sat at the small table with his laptop open, documents spread beside him. Medical reports, CPS notes, the DNA results. Each page felt like a weapon, proof carved into paper, but still he felt exposed. Rick had smirked in that courtroom, and Grant knew men like him didn't smirk unless they had a plan. The first sign came at dawn. A message buzzed through on Grant's phone, no number attached. A picture of the motel's exterior snapped from the parking lot. The caption read, "He's mine. You can't hide him forever." Grant's chest went cold. He checked the lock on the door twice, then looked back at Mason sleeping under the thin blanket, clutching his stuffed otter tight. Grant typed a quick email to Rivera, attaching the photo, then dialed his lawyer. "We need full enforcement of the restraining order," he said, voice clipped. By afternoon, law enforcement had been notified. A patrol car circled the motel twice. Still, Grant's instinct screamed that Rick wasn't going to stay at a distance. 2 days later, those instincts proved right. Grant had taken Mason to a supervised therapy session arranged by CPS. The waiting room was painted in soft blues, toys scattered in a corner. While Mason met with the child counselor behind closed doors, Grant sat stiff in a chair, eyes on the entrance. That's when the door swung open. Rick walked in, not storming, not yelling, just walked in as though he owned the ground under his boots. The security officer at the desk stood immediately, hand out. "Sir, you're not allowed here." Rick sneered but didn't fight. He simply pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and held it out. "Court papers," he said. "I've got rights." Grant rose slowly, every muscle taut. "You have charges," he said evenly. "Not rights to him." Rick's eyes flicked to him, a dangerous gleam under the fluorescent lights. "He'll grow up and see he's mine. You can't rewrite blood." Before the officer could push him back out, Rivera appeared, summoned by the commotion. She took the paper from Rick's hand, scanned it, and shook her head. "This is nothing. An appeal filing. Doesn't grant visitation." She passed it back. "You need to leave before we add trespassing to your list." Rick's jaw flexed. He leaned close enough for only Grant to hear. "You think a piece of paper will stop me? He's in my veins. He'll come to me eventually. You can't keep him." Grant didn't blink. "Then I'll make sure the only place you can reach him from is a prison cell." The officer ushered Rick out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. But the damage was done. Mason had seen him through the half-open therapy room door. When the session ended, Mason's face was pale. He walked to Grant and whispered, "He was here, wasn't he?" Grant crouched, steadying his son's gaze. "Yes, but he's not coming near you again." "But if he's my blood, won't they let him?" Grant tightened his grip on Mason's shoulder. "Blood doesn't decide. Judges do, and they've seen what he's done. They know who you belong with." That night, back at the motel, Grant sat at the table again, drafting a new motion with his lawyer. Request for permanent custody, immediate revocation of parental rights for Rick. Each line was precise, unemotional, but underneath the words pulsed a father's rage. When Mason finally slept, Grant watched him in the dim glow of the lamp. He thought of the welt across his back, the shoebox of index cards, the whispered question, "Am I like him?" Grant clenched his jaw. "No," he said aloud into the silence, as if carving it into stone. "You'll never be him." The next hearing loomed, a confrontation that would decide not just custody, but Mason's future. Rick had played his last card in that waiting room. Now Grant would answer it with the one thing stronger than blood: truth, carried to its final consequence. The courthouse buzzed with muted tension the morning of the final custody hearing. Rain clouds pressed low outside, shadows stretching across the marble floors. Grant walked Mason to the supervised playroom, where Rivera waited with a reassuring smile. Mason clung to his stuffed otter before letting go, whispering, "Don't let him win, Dad." Grant bent down, steady eyes on his son. "I won't." Inside the courtroom, Rick sat at the respondent's table, suit pressed, hair combed back, but his jaw set with barely contained fury. Vanessa sat apart from him, shoulders slumped, face pale, no longer the mocking woman from weeks before. She avoided Rick's gaze completely. The judge entered, robes sweeping, gavel striking once. "We are here to finalize custody and review evidence of parental fitness. Mr. Dalton, you have filed an appeal claiming paternal rights. Mr. Harper seeks permanent sole custody. The court will now hear closing arguments." Grant's lawyer rose first, voice sharp but controlled. "Your Honor, we present a complete chain of evidence. Medical documentation from urgent care, photos of pattern injuries, porch camera footage showing the child forced outside, the belt with Shield 3 insignia, and the child's own written notes recording abuse in his hand. This court must consider not just biology, but safety and well-being." He laid the index cards gently on the evidence table, their thick pencil letters facing upward for all to see. Gasps whispered through the room as the footage replayed. Mason curled on a patio chair in the cold night, Rick's hand wielding a hose. Grant's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure, one hand gripping the table edge until his knuckles whitened. Rick's attorney stood, voice louder, desperate. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges mistakes in discipline, but discipline does not equal abuse. The boy's mother herself allowed this structure. Biological paternity entitles Mr. Dalton to rights that cannot simply be stripped away." The judge's gaze cut sharp. Paternity entitles one to responsibility, not ownership. Then, unexpectedly, Vanessa rose. Her attorney tried to hold her back, but she shook him off. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the room. "It's true," she said. "I let him in. I knew what he was doing, and I told myself it wasn't that bad. But it was worse than I could admit. I was afraid of losing everything, so I mocked Grant, tried to make him small. But the truth is," she turned, eyes glassy, toward Grant. "He was the only father Mason ever had. Rick is just blood, and blood without love is nothing." The silence after her words was absolute. Rick shot up from his chair, fury blazing. "You think you can erase me? He's mine. He'll always be mine." The bailiff stepped forward, ready to restrain him, but the judge's gavel cracked sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Dalton, or I will have you removed." Rick slammed back in his chair, seething. His fists clenched so tight the veins in his arms bulged. The judge leaned forward, voice measured and final. "This court has seen overwhelming evidence of abuse, neglect, and endangerment. The DNA result is noted, but it changes nothing. Rick Dalton, your parental rights are hereby terminated. You are to have no contact, direct or indirect, with Mason Harper. Custody is awarded solely to Grant Harper, with supervised consideration for Mrs. Harper at the court's discretion after evaluation." The gavel struck again, reverberating through the room like the closing of a heavy door. Rick shouted once more, his voice cracking with rage. "This isn't over. He's mine by blood." Grant stood slowly, turning just enough to meet Rick's eyes. His voice was calm, unshakable. "He'll never be yours. Not now. Not ever." Two bailiffs closed in, guiding Rick out as he struggled, curses spilling into the hall. Vanessa sank back in her chair, tears streaking silently, shoulders shaking under the weight of truth she could no longer deny. Grant gathered his papers with steady hands. The storm had raged, but for the first time, light cracked through. Mason's future was no longer shackled by blood, but secured by choice, by love, by the father who refused to let him be broken. When Grant stepped into the hallway, Mason rushed to him, eyes wide with worry. Grant knelt, arms wrapping him tight. "It's done," he whispered. "You're safe." Mason buried his face into his father's shoulder, clutching the otter between them. For the first time in weeks, the boy's trembling wasn't from fear, but from relief. The air felt different when they left the courthouse. Lighter, freer, as if the heavy clouds that had hung over them for weeks had finally broken apart. Mason clutched Grant's hand tightly, the the stuffed otter tucked under his arm. For the first time in what felt like forever, the boy's steps weren't hesitant. They were small but steady, each one taking him farther from the shadows that had haunted his nights. They didn't return to the motel. Instead, Grant drove them to the small apartment he had signed for earlier that week. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a living room with a window that overlooked the quiet street below. But it was theirs, a place untouched by Rick, by bruises, by lies. Mason walked through the doorway, cautiously at first, then wandered room to room, testing the space as if making sure it was real. In his new bedroom, a bold blue rug stretched across the floor. On the desk sat a small lamp shaped like a rocket ship, already waiting. Grant watched as Mason touched the lamp switch, the soft glow lighting up his face. For a fleeting moment, the boy smiled, wide and unguarded, and it caught Grant in the chest. That night they cooked spaghetti on the tiny stove. Mason laughed when sauce splattered onto Grant's shirt, and Grant laughed too, not caring for once about the stain. Later, as Mason brushed his teeth, Grant set up a new dog bed in the living room. The next morning, they drove to the shelter and came home with a gentle mutt, a golden brown dog with cautious eyes and a nervous wag. Mason crouched in front of the dog, hand out, letting it sniff him. The dog leaned forward and pressed its nose into Mason's palm, tail thumping slowly, then faster. Mason's smile stretched wide. "He's not scary," he whispered. Grant ruffled his son's hair. "No, he's just been waiting for the right person to take care of him. Kind of like us." Days turned into weeks. Therapy appointments filled the calendar. Rivera checked in regularly, ensuring the court's orders were followed. Vanessa sent letters from her parenting program. Apologies written in shaky script, filled with regret, but not excuses. Mason read them once, then folded them away in a drawer. He wasn't ready. Grant didn't push. Healing couldn't be forced. It had to come in its own time. One evening, while they ate dinner on the small balcony, Mason asked, "Dad, if he was my blood, will I always think about him?" Grant paused, the fork in his hand stilled. He met his son's eyes. "You'll think about him, yes. The truth doesn't disappear. But thinking about him doesn't mean you're him. You'll grow your own story, Mason, one that has nothing to do with his choices." Mason nodded slowly, chewing on the words the way he chewed his pasta. Then he reached across the table, slipping his small hand into Grant's. "I want my story to be with you." Grant squeezed back, his throat tightening. "It always will be." Later that night, as Mason slept soundly for the first time, without waking from nightmares, Grant stood at the window, watching the street below. The dog dozed at his feet, the quiet hum of the city in the distance. He thought of the long road they'd traveled, the bruises, the shoebox of notes, the courtroom battles, the heavy twist of paternity revealed. He thought of Vanessa's confession, of Rick's fury, of the moment the judge's gavel struck final. But most of all, he thought of the boy asleep in the next room. A boy who had been forced to write his pain on index cards, now writing a new chapter simply by living freely. Grant turned off the light and walked down the hall, pausing at Mason's door. He watched his son breathe evenly, the otter tucked under his chin, the dog curled on the rug nearby. A picture of safety, a picture of survival. Quietly, Grant whispered into the dark, as much to himself as to the boy, "Nobody will ever break you again. Not while I'm here." And for the first time in years, he believed it.